NBC News has learned that nurse Kaci Hickox will be released from her current quarantine in Newark, New Jersey. She's being discharged because she hasn't had symptoms in 24 hours. She'll have to quarantine at home, of course. The governor's office has coordinated with Maine officials and the CDC, and she will be privately transported to Maine, we assume as soon as possible. Joining me now is Dr. Devi Rampal. Thank you so much, doctor, for being on the show. We appreciate you joining us from the NY School of Medicine. And what's your reaction to this latest news that New Jersey is seeming to ease its policy and allowing Nurse Hickox to go back to Maine?
I'm glad they're letting her go back to her home. I mean, from my perspective, there's no ideal solution here, right? But I think that a 21-day quarantine period is reasonable for people returning from West Africa treating Ebola patients. I mean, they might have had exposure. So far, the people who've developed Ebola didn't realize that they had it. They didn't realize that they were at risk for it that way. So I think that the quarantine period does make sense, especially in a place like New York, where if Ebola were to spread in New York City, the problem is it wouldn't just cause a national problem, it would actually affect the international community because there's so many people that go in and out of New York. So the 21-day quarantine period I think is reasonable, but I do agree that we should have it at home and we should make it more, more palatable for these healthcare workers who really are heroes.
And there obviously was some new news this morning about that pediatric patient who was admitted into Bellevue with signs of fever coming from West Africa. Obviously, that could be malaria. We do not necessarily know if it's Ebola. Do you think there's just authorities are proceeding now with an absolute abundance of caution for all these cases?
Well, I think they are. I think that we have to be careful because, of course, people can only catch Ebola if they're exposed to bodily fluids. So there's an exchange of bodily fluids. So with this child, we don't know exactly what's happened. I mean, with a child, it's a little bit more risky because kids are not as aware of what they're doing and there might be more bodily fluids. I think it makes sense to be more cautious. And just going back to the quarantine issue, I mean, I think that it does make sense to at least stay ahead of the curve with one thing as opposed to what we've been doing with a lot of the situations related to Ebola, where something happens and then we're like, oh, okay, now let's learn from our mistakes and then change the policy afterwards. I mean, I think this is a good way of proceeding.
Yeah, better to be cautious from the onset. And good point you just made there with a pediatric patient who might not have the best control over their bodily fluids. It's best to really proceed with caution. Dr. Devi, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate it.
Thanks.